Hey everyone, the St. George election this year is incredibly important. Go to votestg.com to see who's running and what they stand for, or visit us at our voter booth at Digby's Market, Red Rock Bicycles, or down in the park.
What are your, main pillars of your campaign? Where do you feel like there's gaps? Looking at Chris Stewart, I think he was a very popular congressman across the state, but thinking about moving forward and how we're going to take District 2, but also the next legislature going into it, it sounded like the budget was another key point, and financial responsibility was something that was really important to you in bringing and taking it to Washington. And I've listened to a few of the debates and listened to a few of your perspectives on the budget in particular, where if you're looking at the $6 trillion American federal budget, where do you feel like we need, cuts to be made? Is it potentially that we, I'm an advocate for cutting the strings and cutting the purse strings of the government and giving them less money. However, the likelihood that we're going to rein in the amount of spending that we are at the moment, it doesn't seem like it seems like we're a long way from that. So as you build your coalition, I know you're an advocate for term limits. Let's assume you're a 3-term limit guy. Let's assume you got a short window of opportunity to make some changes. What are your go-to first steps as far as trying to rein in that budget?
Yeah, look, if we can just slow government down to a 1% growth rate,
okay,
then we can actually start chipping away at our debt. We don't really have a budget. That's the problem. We do continuing resolutions all the time. We need to actually, and being a business guy, we work on budgets, and we do zero-based budgets, not this is how much we spent this year, let's add 4% next year. That's the federal government model. The federal government model is hurry and spend your money before the end of the year so that you have your baseline budget that you can then add 4% to next year. Now, that's not what we do in business. That's not how we're successful in business. In fact, there's a reverse incentive in business versus the government. If I have a budget and I have employees who are looking at it and saying, you know what, we don't need to spend all this year, I'll probably bonus them if they don't. If they can save money, I'll probably share some of that savings with them because they've been conscientious and they're thinking about the actual business as an entity that needs to be successful so that everyone who is a stakeholder in that business can be successful, whether it's a customer, an employee, a shareholder, or a supplier.
Well, sorry to cut you off.
Yes.
Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah.
And I know you're on roll, but help me understand, because I think there's potentially there's one person listening that's thinking, but the government isn't a business. The government isn't necessarily meant to make a profit, right? And so if that's the mentality, and that's the financial profitability of a business is what makes the creation of it, right? Aside from a podcast, because it never makes money. However, if you think of a business, the whole incentive and then the reason it would continue is because there's profitability there. But the government isn't set up to make a profit. So drawing these two analogies, I can see your perspective, but how do we bridge that gap between the government not being a business and that?
Okay, so I think there's a discipline there in how you create budgets, though.
Okay.
How you create a budget is a discipline that needs to be applied to that. And it needs to be more zero-based, what actually is needed to accomplish our objective versus just a cost plus every year. People say that we are cutting. When the Democrats yell and scream and say, they're cutting, the cuts aren't cuts. They're reductions in increases. That's what a cut is to a Democrat. So if instead of going to a 4% increase, we're only going to increase it by 1%, that would be a huge win because our economy's growth would then be greater than our spending growth in that situation. But okay, let's take away the profit incentive. That maybe it's not the best analogy. I think it does have analogous issues. But what about the nonprofit world? If you're in the nonprofit world, which I have been, and you manage that very effectively because you are rated by organizations like Charity Navigator, who say, hey, if you're spending more than 10 to 15% on administrative, and all of my donations and contributions aren't getting to helping people that I want to help in your charity, then they're going to say, I'm going to think twice about this. I'm not. And if you look at government, it's exactly the opposite. So if I'm spending 10% on overhead, I'm going to get a gold star from Charity Navigator. But I'm spending an exorbitant amount on overhead in the US budget system and through regulators, and much lesser portions are getting into the classrooms or into the actual needed areas. So this goes to your direct question, and that is, what do you do? Well, one of the things that I would do immediately is work I know I can't completely defund or completely obliterate the Department of Education, for example. I need 60 senators to probably do that. But I can increase block grants that are unrestricted to states, so that the states actually can then administer in a much more efficient manner through school district and even with parental involvement how that money is spent. If I just take the amount of money that's spent on K through 12, which is only about 10, it's maybe not even 10% of the Department of Education budget. Think of that. K through 12 spending is like 10% of the education budget. If I just took that 10% and block granted it directly to states and to school districts, I could add $30,000 in new money into our classrooms because I'm not rubbing off the administrative costs of going through the Department of Education. Why should they have anything to say about what's happening in our schools and our classrooms anyway? So let's just separate that, and then let's get the money back where it belongs. It's better, and I think you said it in the very beginning, it's better that they don't take as much money back to Washington, because if it gets there, it's going to get rubbed off for administrative costs and overhead, and we're going to get less back. It'd be better if we just left it here. But short of that, and we did get tax cuts under the Trump administration that were really important. But short of, then let's take the money that is being spent by the federal government and get it back to the states. Because look, the Constitution doesn't even provide for a Department of Education or a lot of other departments that regulate our lives. And we should be pushing as much of those things back to the states as we possibly can. It goes back to the enumeration of powers in the 9th, 10th, and 14th Amendments of the Constitution.
Right. Well, so if looking at the Department of Education, for example, I think I'm just looking at what the budgetary resources for the 2023. It's the Department of Education's 2% of the budget. It's $269 billion, and it looks like over $200 billion of that goes directly to student aid, right? So like financial aid, from the way I'm looking at it. Now, do you think this is a reaction? It's a reaction to the system as a whole, the university system, because I know the biggest portion of this fund I know is going to university. It's not going, like you said, it's not going through K through 12, which I think is the most important part of the education system. From my perspective, we should be putting more emphasis on the younger kids and giving them the resources and tools and the teachers that are doing that versus the university system. However, the universities are making massive profits. They have endowment funds that are in the $1 billion within their own right.
Crazy.
It's crazy, and they're it's protected. So I look at this. It's a big number, but it's interesting to me that the financial aid to the universities, for the universities that already have the money, within their own funds and things like that, it's still a small drop in the bucket when we're talking about $6 trillion. But is the Department of Education, is that kind of like, is that where you think you would start? Is that just an example of what needs to be
for
changed?
low-hanging fruit? Look, let's be completely honest here. Entitlements have to be on the table. Young guys like you who are making good money and who are figuring out life, you are in a position to take care of yourself in a much better way than depending on Social Security. We should never touch Social Security for people who are in the system or who are near entering the system. But if you're in your 20s, 30s, even 40s, we need to change the actuarial tables are different than they were when these were set up. We can certainly push out retirement age longer. Just adding a couple of years will make a significant difference in how this payout and how the Social Security system will be able to pay out over time.
Did they riot in France?
We need to offer different programs. I mean, I loved Buffett when they said, well, what would you tell your wife if you were gone and you were advising your wife what she should do, for her retirement? And he said something very, very insightful, very simple. He said, I would tell her to put her money in an index fund, a no load index fund, and just let it ride, and just keep putting it in and let it ride. And over time, it's going to well outperform anything that Social Security is ever going to do for somebody that's in their 20s, 30s, 40s.
Well, if we had the index fund back in the 60s, when we kept Social Security going, thanks LBJ. If we had an index fund back then, I think we would have gotten that great advice. But since that only happened in the 90s, I guess as a millennial, that's all I get is the index funds and not Social Security. But you're
probably smarter and can figure out something even better. But I'm just saying that if you want to not have to worry about it, index fund is an easy way to do it.
I think in retrospect, Social Security wasn't something that was supposed to last forever, but here we are. And entitlements, it's a third rail. It was the third rail of politics post Nixon, right? I mean, it's always been one of those things that if you want to get the American voter, the person who actually shows up to the booth or mails it in these days, if you're actually trying to get to the person that actually votes, entitlements are kind of a third rail.